All right, beautiful. We are now live. Thank you all so much for being here today. Today I am joined by Dr. L.S. Dugdale and Christy Schaefer and Frank Pester. And we are going to be talking about Dr. Dugdale's newest book, The Lost Art of Dying, Reviving Forgotten Wisdom. Dr. Lydia Dugdale is Associate Professor of Medicine and Director of the Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at Columbia University. Prior to her 2019 move to Columbia, she was Associate Director of the Program for Biomedical Ethics and founding co-director of the Program for Medicine, Spirituality, and Religion at Yale School of Medicine. She is an internal medicine primary care doctor and medical ethicist. Her first book, Dying in the 21st Century, provides the theoretical grounding for this current book. She lives with her husband and daughters in New York City. Christy Schaefer is going to be in conversation with Lydia Dugdale today. And Christy Schaefer has been an intermittent bookseller from coast to coast, has a BA in creative writing, and is a future death doula with intentions of caring for the homeless population at the end of their lives. She lives in New Orleans within easy walking distance of at least 5 cemeteries and a very good Cafe Botanica. And so, yeah, how this is going to go, there will be about 40 minutes of conversation between Lydia and Christy. My coworker, Frank Pester, will pop on to ask about 10 minutes of questions. And then the last 10 minutes, we're going to be ending with an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions for Lydia or Christy while you're watching, please drop them in the YouTube chat box off to the side, and I'll make sure they get asked. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to the two of you, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Salem.
So hi. Thank you so much for talking with us. I've been watching some interviews with you and have learned quite a lot over the course of reading your book and of course hearing you speak. And I would like to start, and I've written things down, so I'm not ignoring you, I'm just reading. And you write about hospitals a fair bit, of course. And I was, that didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was learning about CPR, what it actually is, and the toll that it can take on a body, especially an ill or frail body. And in a general way, it leads me to think about the distance that we have from understanding not just medicine and how it operates, but our own bodies and what it can take or they can take. And it's kind of alarming, that distance that we have of knowledge, between knowledge and reality. And I was wondering how you think we can come closer to an accurate understanding of what our bodies can actually take, what an intervention actually is, so that we can make better decisions towards, in these extreme times towards death.
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's tricky to expect for a non-clinically trained person ever to fully understand what someone who's been clinically trained understands, right? There's just a knowledge gap there, just like when I take a car to the mechanic. I have no idea what's going on, right? So even if I read about things online or watch some YouTubes or something like that, there's always that knowledge gap. And part of the reason that I wrote the book, The Lost Art of Dying, is because I wanted to empower my patients to be able to face their mortality and engage with healthcare in a way that is beneficial to them and not harmful to them. Every intervention we have in medicine has both harms and benefits. There are always risks to everything, even the most seemingly benign medication that you might take. Everything has a risk. And so part of the job of the clinician is to help patients weigh those risks, the risks against the balanced against the benefits. And with regard to end of life, the risks and the toll that some of the interventions take on the body are so much greater, right? It's more than just taking an aspirin. when you're on a mechanical ventilator, or when dialysis is essentially cleaning your blood for you, doing the work of the kidneys. That's far more invasive than most people realize. And so a good physician would really help the patient weigh those risks and balances. Now, part of the difficulty here is that we don't quite realize what we might need or what we might get into. So in January of 2020, no one would foresee, a ventilator shortage or a crisis, an oxygen shortage. No one could foresee the COVID crisis that we had. And that raised new questions for many people. Would I even want to be in the intensive care unit? Would I even want to be on these machines? So we have multiple challenges, right? We have challenges of a disparity or a gap in knowledge and exposure and training. We can't foresee what someone might need, and really the possibilities are endless. Having said that, part of what I aim to do in the book is to start giving people, my patients, I wrote the book for my patients, I'm a primary care doctor, start giving people some basic tools, some basic questions to ask. And to press their clinicians for answers. So every doctor in his or her mind is sitting there thinking, oh, I would do this or I would not do this. We're trained to think that way. So every time I do something for a patient, I'm already thinking, well, if this were my mother, if this were my father, I would do this or I wouldn't do this. So these adjudications are happening all the time. But what patients need to do is to sort of insist on having access to that information. Mm-hmm. Insist on having answers to those questions. So sometimes people do say to me, would you do this for your mother? And that, some doctors don't like to answer that question. I have no trouble answering that question because I give my family members the same advice I give my patients, which is the best medical advice that I can give them, taking into account the particulars of a situation. So I'd like to think that what I've tried to offer patients with regard to approaching the end of life is some basic tools for starting to know how to ask the right questions, and then insisting on certain kinds of information to help them know whether to proceed or not.
Oh, that sounds very good. Do you talk to other doctors about this? I mean, most doctors are great as far as answering questions, but there are, I will say, old school, where it's like the doctor knows best and you don't need to know, you just need to go along with it. I feel like there is a move away from that, thank goodness. But having accompanied some of my elderly relatives to their elderly doctor's appointments, there is still very much a kind of hierarchical relationship that I think can get in the way of this kind of needed information and the making the best decisions together.
That's right. Right. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly a generational shift, right? So in the 70s really is when there started to be a pushback against physician paternalism, the kind of idea that doctor knows best and, just shut up and listen to me sort of attitude, do what I say. There was a lot of pushback, and that's where we started to have the patients' rights movement. Mm-hmm. So patients then becoming equipped and sort of empowered to insist on information, and you start to see in hospitals patients' bills of rights. Yes. I think that's right, bills of rights. Having said that, there's certainly people practice in different ways, and the time crunch in medicine is real. So I've had colleagues who say, I try to talk to patients as little as possible because, the next patient's waiting, the next patient's waiting, the next patient's waiting. So there is, the way the system is structured as even if it's not for profit, there still is a pressure for clinicians to generate revenue for healthcare systems. Unfortunately, that is the way the systems are structured and designed for the most part in this country. That's what we voted for, in a sense. Mm-hmm. And so that puts enormous pressure on clinicians to keep sort of going through the next patient. And that translates into unhappy doctors and unhappy patients. But sometimes what we need to do, and I say this in the book, is we need to press pause. Right? We need to press pause and just say, wait, time out. We're talking about you name it, brain surgery for my mother. We're talking about chemotherapy for my elderly family member. What truly are the benefits of this chemotherapy for an elderly woman, you name it, age 85, who's already failed 3 rounds of chemotherapy or 3 types of chemotherapy? What is the benefit? I need to understand. We as a family, we need to understand that benefit. And that's the sort of language that I want to encourage patients not to be belligerent or to beat up their doctors. I'm a doctor, I don't want to be beat up. The system beats me up. But to just say, wait a second, I know you think you're explaining it, but we need more information. We're not quite getting it. Please, let's just pause for a second and give us the answers that we need. And that's what I'd love to see more of. So you're right, medicine is practiced imperfectly by imperfect human beings, but we can always, press pause and ask for a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, not just for the 85-year-old. I mean, as a 34-year-old, I was diagnosed with cancer myself. And I mean, there are a lot of questions that come up.
Right.
And, it's a scary word. And I think that that's, a greater understanding of like, what does it mean to have this or that kind of an illness, whatever it is, can help you make a better decision. I'm still alive, obviously, because I have very good doctors who knew what they were doing. So moving on a little bit, over the pandemic, a lot of people really took the time to reorder what is important, what does matter, how to live a better life, or at least one that they found less annoying, however they wanted to phrase it. Fewer were eating, drinking, and being merry in their outlook. Like, when I get out, I'm going to party, although there's some of that. But most were really taking a longer view. And so I have seen a shift in focus. And it seems that there are some commonalities with the post-bubonic plague years. Mm-hmm. And I found it kind of funny that your book was coming out when it did, in relation, historically speaking. It's like, well, that's fortuitous. Are you seeing this as well, in your practice, that shift?
Yeah, to sort of seizing the day and living more largely. It's interesting that you draw the parallel to the bubonic plague. So just for anyone who might be watching, the book kind of riffs off the bubonic plague of the 1300s, which devastated Western Europe and led to the deaths of perhaps as many as 2/3 of Europeans. And what happened as Europe kind of recovered and sort of, pulled itself up after this massive loss of life was that there was a real insistence on the part of people for help in knowing how to anticipate death and prepare for it. And it resulted in the birth of a genre of literature, which is what I sort of describe in the book in part. And I ask in the book, could we reimagine this genre of literature, this art of dying body of literature today? And why is it that we are so reluctant actually to face our deaths? So could this be realized today? Now, I the documentation from the late Middle Ages is kind of variable, but more recently, looking at what happened a century ago in the United States with 1914 to 1918 as U.S. involvement in World War I, huge loss of life worldwide, civilians and soldiers, right? Women and children, just millions and millions and millions of people died around the globe. And then even before World War I is over, we have the outbreak of the flu pandemic. Some people have called the Spanish flu, but it's the flu pandemic of 1918, which actually was the flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920. And really lasted about 2 years. Historians and health experts think maybe there were 4 waves worldwide, but who knows? I mean, you look at waves, they're different in every country, they're different in parts of the countries. And then we went, in this country anyway, in the US, into what came to be known as the Roaring 20s. a time when, and this is really where we saw the demise of this art of dying genre of literature, which had circulated since the late Middle Ages, bubonic plague. So for more than 500 years, people were very interested in thinking about what it means to live well and cultivate the kind of life that would lead then to dying well. But that idea, the idea that we would want to even think about what it means to die well, fell out of favor in the 1920s. Exactly, I mean, I think partly, but exactly for what you were saying, that the shift in focus was, we have just had 6 years of death, 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 and we're sick of it. And we don't want to think about what it means to die well. And women stopped dressing in mourning during that time and actually never went back. It had been customary for hundreds of years to hang certain ribbons on the front door if someone had died. If a child had died, an adult had died, it depended, they would hang different ribbons. That went away. And what we see, and then really women mourning for a full year after the loss of a spouse, that went away. And we see this big push to, really new kinds of music, dance, women get the right to vote, the birth of antibiotics in the late 1920s, and then medical technology takes off. So a really, really huge shift. Interestingly, also, if the art of dying genre of literature was initially birthed in the church, which it was in the West, the social authority being the Western church, by the 1920s, for people who have studied the texts of preachers from pre-1920s into the 1920s, they stopped telling their congregants about the need to prepare for death. So this idea that preparation for death is just part of life, which had been kind of in the water forever, that all went away in the 1920s and hasn't come back, frankly. And, question whether it'll come back with COVID. And it looks like we're moving into getting back with life as we knew it, right?
Maybe. Well, you talked, speaking of mourning, death traditions. I live in a city that has some, famous death traditions, the second line. And I wouldn't say we revel in death, but it certainly is they do have cemetery tours. So it's not like something that we sweep under the rug, although I don't think it's something that we totally understand. A second line here, I think is a very valuable thing. And I don't know if you've ever been to one, but basically the familiar pattern is for it to be a real second line, there has to be a body or a huge picture if it's happening like later because the relatives couldn't get there. And I've been to both kinds, and they're both very moving. But there's a band and they play on the way to the cemetery. They'll play the somber songs. On the way from the cemetery, they will play joyous songs of like, and we're still living, and I'll Fly Away is a tearjerker, so I'm not going to talk about it too much because my tears. But one that I went to recently, and you can get into a whole bunch of New Orleans culture, so I'll try to like keep it brief, but there's a woman who died. She was very important in her community, and our group went to give water because it was hot, and we didn't want people to faint while they were dancing because there's dancing, and the body was there, which I didn't expect for this one, in a coffin, so not just like there, but in a coffin. So the glass-sided hearse comes up, followed by the mourners and the band, and they take her out and danced and passed. She had one last dance, so she was still part of the community in the same way, or in a way that you talk about Aretha Franklin and John McCain, who died at around the same time, and their last participation in church. And I think that chance to say goodbye, that chance to have here that one last dance or that one last sitting with or look at someone is very important. And of course, in times of plague, Black Death, everybody into the pit as soon as possible. With COVID, a similar situation. I think that mourning, if we were to mourn better, we would also, I think, be able to prepare ourselves better, because it would like step by step help us accept that this is inevitable. Do you want 1,000 people to come and dance with you? If you do, you better live a good life. Or 100, however many. So I'm hoping that we'll get back to, ideas of that ritual. You mentioned your grandmother had died and you wish that you could wear mourning so that there's that unspoken, I am grieving, and that gathers some respect, from the people with you.
Yeah, I love that description. I mean, I've never seen a body removed from a casket and passed.
Oh no, just the casket. They didn't take
Just
her
the
out.
casket. Okay, they
Yes.
didn't
Oh
take her
no,
out.
you should
Wow,
not see
I was
that.
gonna say I can't imagine that, but okay. So my imagination was running ahead of me.
That's okay.
But still, to think about that one last dance, right? Yeah, it implies a certain comfort with death and proximity to death that many people don't have. I mean, to even think of passing around a casket or a coffin, right? Depending on your preferred word, is really fascinating. And my sister and I were just talking yesterday, maybe about when my grandfather died. And I talk in the book about my family's own comfort with death. We grew up in a household that talked about death because my grandfather was a bomber pilot and a prisoner of war in World War II. And he just talked about his death all the time. He never thought he'd live to age 95. So it was kind of just in the culture of our family that we had this comfort with our mortality. And we're very frank about it. But both my sister and I photographed my grandmother at my grandfather's open casket and thought nothing of it until we started reading about different kinds of taboos and some people would never photograph, for example, the face. Mm-hmm. In a casket. And then there were periods of time and there were cultures and communities where it was very common actually to photograph the dead. And that was part of the memorial. So it's different, and different cultures and different communities have different ways of growing in their comfort with the idea of death and with mortality. But you've alluded to ritual, and that's something I do spend some time in the book talking about, because ritual helps to sort of provide the roadmap through the chaos. Mm-hmm. And when a community develops ritual, particularly communities that have developed rituals over time, we know what we're going to sing, right? We don't have to figure this out. We don't have to make it up. We sing these 5 songs going to the cemetery, and we sing another 5 songs coming home, right? We know how we're going to approach the body. I love the Jewish tradition for what it offers in terms of mourning rituals. Incredible context. It just makes sense, and it's kind of prescribed. But you know what? When somebody dies, and especially if you're not at all prepared for this death, what you want is somebody to just tell you what you have to do. And that's what ritual does. It provides that guide. And so whether it's, dancing with the coffin or photographing the dead or embalming or not, I talk a little bit about even how embalming can become a little bit like a ritual. It's important. It's really critical for us to wrestle with these questions in the context of our close communities, whether that's family or some other way that we define community. Wrestle with these questions and talk about it before we're kind of pressed and rushed and into making these decisions because someone has died. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that story, though. Thank you, Christy.
Oh, surely. You did go into the Jewish care of the body after someone has died. And I thought that was quite beautiful. And it does contrast so sharply with this idea of death as an unclean thing. And under normal circumstances, it's not. You don't have to fear infection from an uninfected body. I mean, obviously, you need to take care of it. You can't just keep it forever, unless you're Egyptian, apparently. But that idea of having that guidance in a time that feels so formless and out of time is crucial, I think. And I death customs. I used to be very into the goth scene, and you still see, it's very deathy looking and stuff. And now when I was reading your book, I'm wondering, it's like, have we lost something in taking that out of the context of actually mourning?
Yeah.
When things like Jack Skellington or other various movie characters are so popular, and it's like, oh, cute death. Do we lose something of what death is when we commercialize it like that?
Yeah, no, I think we do. It's funny, I was thinking about the goth scene the other day too. Yeah, I mean, there are different sort of communities, whether they're cultural or artistic or whatever, that have focused on death, but the focus on the morbid, if it's cut off from an actual death or the actual experience of caring for the dying and grieving loss, is something lost there? Does it just become sort of hyperbolic or sensationalized? I mean, probably, right? I'm trying to think of who's the artist who does skulls, like his whole thing is skulls.
Oh, there's a bunch.
There's a guy that does them in diamonds. I can't remember.
Oh, yeah. Daniel Hurst.
Yes, yeah.
Hurst. Damien.
Right. Does it, I mean, the cost of his work aside, but would the work mean something more if it were actually done for someone, like either someone who truly was practicing the memento mori, right? Having those reminders of their finitude so that they would examine thetheir lives and think about how they're living in order to prepare for death. Does it make a difference, or it doesn't make a difference if it's just a billionaire who wants, a multi-million-dollar piece of art hanging on his wall? Is something lost? And I think we could say, well, for sure, if the images of death or the sort of the symbols of grief are just there as ornaments, and they're not there to motivate a change in one's life or reflection or the kind of work we need to do in the context of our communities to prepare together corporately for death, then definitely something is lost.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Never have Damien Hurst on my ofrenda. Nope.
Couldn't afford it, so not.
Oh, well, there's that. So now you were talking. I've watched a couple of interviews with you, primarily on the Veritas forum,
Mhm.
And there was one in Beyond the Forum, and regarding COVID restrictions and the idea of the lonely death. And you also wrote about in Japan, the program that they had to prevent or at least lessen the number of people who died alone, whose family and friends had all died off, or they were just in a different area. And certainly during COVID, that was thrown into sharp relief. Even people who had people were dying alone. I wanted to say, well, what's the answer? How can we cure that? And I do want to, that's my basic underlying question. Like, what are some steps that we can take rather than say, doctor, heal us all, like, what can we do in our neighborhoods to try to prevent this kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, what was so shocking to me, and that I was taking care of COVID patients during the worst of the pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, I still take care of patients. So we just don't have very many COVID patients right now, thankfully. What was shocking to me is that the policies to prohibit visitors or severely restrict visitors remained in place as long as they did, even after numbers were rapidly declining in communities. To the point that in New York City, people were going back to indoor gyms and eating in restaurants without restrictions. And yet in New York State, the vast majority of nursing homes were still not permitting visitors. And some hospitals, I'm personally very proud of my own hospital for very quickly relaxing visitor restrictions, even if there were still some, it was not 12 hours a day, but it was 2 hours a day. Still, people could get visitors in, and that was so important. And actually, very early on, we started having, if patients were dying, we permitted family to come in, so that we could really very early on mitigate this problem of dying alone. That was a priority, but a full year. It took a full year for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to give nursing homes the guidance that they should really liberalize their visitor restrictions. And even still, a month after that, those guidelines, so we're talking April of 2021, in an informal poll, some 60% of long-term care facilities said they still had restrictions. So and I'm not sure, it's July now, I'm not sure 3 months later what the numbers are. Certainly there still are institutions that have significant restrictions. Can people go 15 months without seeing their family members? I mean, without a hug, without touch? And we know, I mean, we've got plenty of data that shows that people lose weight, they get more depressed, they stop eating. We know that loneliness hastens death. That's not a medical mystery. And so to thwart death from a virus, we hastened death for many, many people by virtue of our policies. So this was imposed. And that's shocking to me. I mean, on the one hand, it's shocking. On the other hand, it's like, well, of course, who do we forget about? We forget about small children and the elderly who are in institutions. So I have written about this and I have spoken about this, and I feel like I need to write more about this, but I do think that when all of this settles out from COVID, or if, as the UK has just said, we're going to start treating this like something we're living with in perpetuity. We need to go back to a normal functioning society. That's fine. As we accept risks of perhaps more infection, the ones that we should not forget about are the ones who really do need our attention and who have the least freedoms. And those are small children and the elderly and folks who are not elderly, but living with disabilities in long-term care facilities. I mean, we need to treat them humanely. So it's not just the lonely dying, which was awful. Although in the early part of the pandemic, I really felt necessary. It was so crazy in the hospital. It was so crazy in the hospital. We had no idea what we were dealing with. We didn't have PPE. I think it was right to have restrictions. It was a tragedy that people died alone. It absolutely was, no question. I was so grateful our hospital bought something like 5,000 iPads. I was so great for technology that at least people could say goodbye, or at least families could FaceTime, right? At least we had that, right? But now that things are getting so much better in so much of the country, we need to not keep people locked up. And that's really how it's felt for so many people.
There had been programs that paired young people, like the littles, with people in senior citizens' homes, the care homes, and that I mean, we talk about dying lonely, which is terrible, but also living lonely. That seemed to be a really good perk for both ends of the spectrum there, um, age-wise. And I think I think stuff like that should happen more, for a variety of reasons. I mean, obviously, you learn things from older people, but you also learn things from younger people. I returned to school at 45 to get my BA, and like one of the best things was meeting all these kids. They're not really, they're adults, but they're in their, late teens, early 20s, into their 30s, and just like seeing these wonderful energies, you know. And I think there has to be a way to connect people so that
Yeah.
they don't have like, oh, all my friends are also 60 and we're all going to die at the same time. Oh, no, wait, I'm living to 80.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Actually, I grew up in Michigan in the Midwest, and we had an adoptive grandparents program through our
Nice.
church where any kids who didn't have grandparents in town were paired with any elders who didn't have grandkids in town. And it was great. I had my adoptive grandmother. I visited her regularly. We did crafts together. There was something really lovely about that. And also, for me as a child who didn't regularly see and spend sort of quality time with the extreme elderly, it was fantastic. But I also recently learned about, in Wisconsin, there's a community, I think it's a former nunnery is probably the wrong word, but it is a former, I guess, space for religious order. And they're now, the sisters who remain in that order are building a site that brings in single mothers with children, and then seniors. So there's like the senior section that's paying market value, that's offsetting the cost of single women with their children. And then the elderly nuns are all living in sort of an apartment kind of arrangement together on this campus that used to be sort of a religious order campus. And it's partnered with a local college. I can't remember the name of it. Yes, I mean, it sounds wonderful, but that's exactly what we need, right? So we have children with single mothers who actually need a community, right?
Mhm.
And then we have the retirees who have the means to buy into this community and can also, and are doing it intentionally, right?
Mhm.
Recognizing that there'll be single mothers there with lots of children around. But there's something really beautiful about putting them together, in the context of this sort of aging religious order, to help meet the needs of everyone. Because it's exactly the case that, we're not meant to be segregated by age.
Right.
That happens in society. My kids are school age, and so a lot of our peer group is parents with school age children. That's just what happens. But I think we need to fight that, challenge the way that sort of modern society pushes us into these groupings, and try to look for unique ways to partner across the age groups. And I love the adoptive grandparents, grandchildren idea. That's great.
I think it could go a long way into providing people. It gives you, as you get older, you might look towards your future, but knowing the younger people, you're looking towards the future. And I think that is an encouragement to like, what kind of ancestor am I going to be, is
That's right.
a question that I ask. And
Yeah.
I think that's one that you can ask more easily when you see, the next generation coming up too.
I love that, Christy. What kind of ancestor am I going to be? That's such a great question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I'm going to turn the time over to Frank now to ask some questions.
Well, after all of this good conversation, it was touched on most of my questions, but I did want to maybe make this a testimonial. This book came out around the time of my mom's death. I was taking care of mom, and she had dementia, and working at the bookstore, and it was really tough. But I wish this book had come out much earlier, about a year earlier. I picked a review copy up and read it, and it just flowed, and it had some really, really good ideas and just comfort that I got from it. I mean, my the question that I have, this is really tough for me to talk about, but you guys were talking about this book is an excellent book for people reading about death, I guess. But you know, the tough part about me and my sister, who were taking care of mom and working and whatnot, was it would be great if there was a book like this for caregivers or something like that. And do you believe that more books like this should be written?
Yeah, no, great questions. So I don't know the caregiver literature in the same way. I wrote as a doctor, and I've read all the doctor books on death, and felt that what was available was not meeting the needs of my patients, because it didn't, many of the doctor books on death didn't, for example, touch on ritual or fear of death. That's something that no one wants to write about. How do you write about fear of death? And they don't touch on spirituality, because then whose spirituality, and how do you choose, and what is truth, and all those questions start cropping up. So it's easier not to go there. And I felt that those questions, even if, and as you know from the book, I'm not prescribing any particular way for people to think. I'm putting the questions on the table, and sort of nudging people from the standpoint of someone who grew up in the West, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, sort of saying that this is where I'm coming from. But we need to think about these questions, because I've taken care of patients who are actively dying, and then trying to ask these questions, and it's just too late. So that's so I tried to write from that perspective, from what I know. I'm a doc, and this is what I know. So to answer your question, I don't know everything that is out there for a caregiver. My guess is you looked and didn't find something quite satisfying. Are you thinking along the lines of sort of how to keep, like the how to care, the actual how to care, or the sort of how do I do this in a way to keep my sanity and keep my wits about me, but also care well? And what do I do about moral distress and burnout and those kinds of ways? Are those kind of the things? Or I'm curious now.
Well, kind of like that, but we were fortunate. I know I'm talking to you from Salt Lake City, but we're Baptists here in Salt Lake, and my minister was good. I lost both my parents the last 4 years. In both cases, our pastor was helping us with taking care, and he did suggest both parents needed hospice and needed to be taken. The fact that you talk about dying alone, because that's my fear, because once my sister's gone, I have no relatives or anything to take care of me, so I'm going to be alone. But the fact that we were able to, it was just fortunate in mom's case, because her dementia, and that's what she died. Basically, she fell and broke her hip, but then she had dementia, and then that kept going worse and worse, to the point where, she would not eat. She forgot how to swallow and stuff like that. But the fact that there were things here that, how to take care of your parents, how to make sure that they're, the questions you have when hospice says that they can't resuscitate a patient. My sister, we both had the same beliefs, and her belief was that God could possibly heal her at any moment.
Yeah.
And she signed those papers, and yet, I knew that what hospice was telling, what you discuss in the book about crushing her ribs and stuff like that, because she was so frail, would be the point. But there's books that maybe from religious or from how to solve these questions and stuff like that.
No, there's so many questions, right? And they're so different, and yet there's so many commonalities to them. It's interesting though. I always tell my patients when they talk about belief in miracles, I say I believe in miracles, which is true. I do. I've seen miracles. but God does not need a mechanical ventilator to bring you back from the dead, right? So it's okay. I mean, if you have an old heart, and I'm talking, definitely 90s, your heart, there's no point in trying to resuscitate a 90-year-old heart. Probably there's not much point in trying to resuscitate most hearts in their 80s. Now, there are exceptions always, but you can get the engine going again, but if it's an old engine, it's not going to run very long. So to inflict all of the hardship on a very old body to just try to get that very old engine running a little bit more does not feel like a humane way to approach the end of one's life, right? Whether for oneself or someone else. So, but yes, I mean, I would say to your sister, if she were sitting in my office space, I'm fully on board with belief in miracles, but we don't need the mechanical ventilator, right? I mean, Lazarus did not have a mechanical ventilator. Right. Right. And so, but there's so many of these questions, and that's where some of this, back to Christy's the beginning of our conversation, some of this, you really need a good conversation with a clinician who can guide you wisely, because it's the baby boomers where there's no easy, you have a very healthy baby boomer. I'm not going to say don't resuscitate, because it could be, a really healthy baby boomer could have a wonderful heart that could easily keep going for quite a while. But there's so much nuance here. I mean, what does the heart look like? How is it functioning? How did it function? Have you had a heart attack? That's why I think you need really good guidance. And then the way that I'm trying to encourage my patients is, so here's how you push for good guidance. Because unless you're clinically astute, you do need some guidance, but you also need to push for that. So yeah, no, you got my wheels turning though about the book, about another book.
Well, another question I had, and you touched a little bit about the conductor that passed away or whatnot. Mm-hmm. Music, my pastor said, music is an important part in comforting the dying patient. We had, when my dad passed away, a family group of a large family of our church came and sang to him into the house. And I know that my pastor said, well, just sing to mom, because this was the last night of her being here. And so me and my sister sang church hymns to her and comforted her. And it seemed like that once we stopped singing those songs, that her body just kind of gave up and felt at ease.
Yeah, there's so much about giving permission. People know when they're ready, and sometimes it's that, there's like this kind of climax, whether it's the family gathering or the hymns. My grandfather had a very similar thing. The family was gathering and singing. Pastor shows up and prays, and he basically dies. I mean, it's almost like he was holding on for that. And we see this all the time in the hospital, this kind of waiting, holding on, and then a release. And sometimes we can actually give our family members that release, because often, especially for people who are very oriented towards serving others, they'll hold on because they know that when they die, it'll be really hard. And so they keep holding on. And sometimes we have to say, Mom, it's okay. It's okay.
That's kind of the way it went. I mean, but anyway, that's all that I have. But I did really enjoy your book, and it was one of my picks on the store shelf.
Oh, thank you so much. Really appreciate the questions too.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your time today. This has been such a thoughtful and informative conversation. I just have a couple of questions in the last few minutes that we have here. I don't want to be too redundant with this, because I know that we've touched on COVID like a few separate times during this conversation. But I wanted to ask what you think the lasting ramifications of the COVID pandemic will be, and how that might look different in the States versus like India, for example.
Ooh, ramifications in terms of impact on the preparation for death, or are you talking more? Okay. So yes. That's in my wheelhouse. Sorry, I couldn't talk to you about governments and economies and things. Yeah, this is where we need Christy. I'm a little pessimistic, actually. So yeah, my book riffs off of the bubonic plague. I finished writing the full manuscript a full year before anyone had heard of COVID. So it's a book very much about plague that was released in the midst of a global pandemic. I could have never foreseen it. And yet, I've done probably 70 of these talks in the last year, and it's interesting to me still how unwilling many people are to talk. I mean, how many millions of people dead from COVID, and we still don't really want to talk about the need to prepare for death. So I wish maybe I'm basing my comments on book sales. I don't know, but I wish I could say that people have been really engaged and there's been this revolution in our thinking, and suddenly people are writing their wills. I've talked to young people even who were very, very sick on the brink of death with COVID, and what they've said to me in the Q&A in events like this, I just don't even want to think about it. I just want to get back to life as usual. And I have said to people in conversation, well, have you're 45, you have children, have you at least written a will and thought about to whom your children would go if something happened to you and your partner? And I can't think about that. Now, that's not true for everyone. I would say I've had more conversations with baby boomers who have really gotten their stuff in order. They've looked at the pandemic, they look at the odds, and they say, well, goodness, if I get sick, yeah, odds are I could get really, really sick and I might not recover. And so I've talked to a number of older people who, older being boomers, I'm talking about, who have gotten their stuff together. Actually, and I have had some interesting conversations with people who read my book and reconciled with family members and have tried intentionally to build relationship with adult children from whom they were estranged and things like that. So there are some people making some good steps. Communities, countries such as India, I'm no expert there, but countries that do have rituals related to death, much more built into the fabric of everyday life, I think will come out ahead on this question of, are they prepared for death? I just think they will, because there's more prep work being done all the time. Yeah.
Thank you. The last question that I have for you, if there's like a single thought or message that you'd like our audience to leave with tonight from this conversation or from your book, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, it's just that it's really basic. Whether we're in a pandemic or not, mortality is still 100%. We keep forgetting that, it's like, oh, we get through COVID and we're not going to die. No, we're all going to die. Every single one of us is going to die. So since that is true, then we should think very carefully about how we want to prepare for that. And then to sort of work backwards and think about how we want to live differently with a view to the fact that we will, in fact, all die. And it requires some homework. But as I say, I gave a talk once, and a gentleman asked me, he said, I know who I want to be at my deathbed, but I really can't stand the guy. And so can I just wait until I'm closer to the end and then sort of reconcile with him? And of course, right, that's a silly question, because none of us knows when the end really is, even if we're healthy now. So to attend to our homework now and not save it up, I think is what we need to do.
Great, thank you. Christy or Frank, do either of you have any closing thoughts? Okay, super great. Well, thank you all so much for your time tonight. This was an absolutely beautiful conversation. Anyone watching at home, if you enjoyed this, please consider supporting Lydia by buying a copy of her book, and please consider supporting our bookstore by buying it through us. I'll leave a link in the YouTube chat where you can do so. But yeah, with all that being said, I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your night, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you all so much.